Now, for more on this, we are now joined from our Pretoria studios by Dr. Virginie Grzelczyk, a lecturer in international relations at Aston University in the United Kingdom, and she is in South Africa for some time. Dr. Grzelczyk, thank you so much for joining us. Now, South Korea just elected a new president who takes a more conciliatory approach to North Korea than his predecessor. How might this affect the North Korea's North nuclear activities?
It's a bit difficult to say. It seems that the DPRK in North Korea is really focused on developing their nuclear programs. They have been doing this for a while, and it seems quite difficult to find ways to stop this at this point. What we would hope, I think, from the new South Korean president would be a renewed dialogue between the two Koreas to start to talk about some pressing issues of security and to some extent reconciliation.
Now, what does Pyongyang's most recent missile test tell us about their capabilities and intentions?
Well, it tells us that they are getting closer to have a means to deliver nuclear weapons. If we have a look at their history, their development history in terms of nuclear weapons, but also missile, they have tested a number of times, and the tests have really accelerated over the past few years under Kim Jong-un. We do know that they probably have the capacity to have nuclear weapons. What remains unclear is the capacity to launch those weapons quite far across, and especially in terms of ICBM, and whether they can develop a technology that would allow the re-entry of a missile, which would allow for those weapons, those nuclear warheads, to be delivered quite far away. Sometimes the tests are not successful. There was a test a few weeks ago that didn't go very well. But the fact that the tests are repeated and that the test a few days ago was successful tells us that they are quite committed to their program, and that it would be very difficult probably to have them stop right away.
Now, you mentioned the success of the test that was done, I think it was over the weekend, which landed very close to Russia. What's the reaction been from Russia with regards to this in terms of their relations with North Korea?
Well, Russia has specified that they are quite concerned and that they are not willing to allow North Korea to be part of the nuclear weapons club. This is something that has also been talked about by the United States. So we are really at a point where we have this problem because North Korea is knocking at the door and say, well, we do have the technology. We are showing you by testing, which is what usually happens in terms of nuclear weapons and weapons. You need to kind of show that you are able to do it. So the problem is that if North Korea is going on with this and becomes a nuclear power, the door is open for other countries to also do so. And that is something that a lot of that the superpowers are not willing to allow, definitely.
Speaking of the superpowers and the show by North Korea of its prowess, what does this mean in terms of a threat for the United States?
Well, I think that the threat to the United States is a very United States-focused question. When we have a look at the type of delivery potential, what we know is the region, Northeast Asia, is quite at risk. It's not just about delivering weapons, it's also the risk of accident with technology. And the population that would really be at risk is the population that lives in South Korea, that lives in Japan, that lives in part of China and part of Russia. The threat when it comes to the United States is much more about the relationship between the United States and North Korea, and the will that North Korea has to develop a credible nuclear deterrent. It seems that North Korea is very focused on having this deterrent so that it is not being attacked, so that it basically continues to develop the way it wants without foreign interference. I think it's unlikely that the DPRK would press on the button and send a nuclear weapon to the United States first. They have repeatedly said that they want to become a responsible nuclear power and that they are doing this for their sovereignty.
Now, with US President Donald Trump and his recent suggestions that he would be willing to meet with the North Korean leader, how likely is that meeting to take place?
I think it's very difficult to speculate right now when it comes to the United States about what may or may not be taking place. There's quite a lot of news that often comes about every hour or every 2 hours. It's quite difficult, I think, to keep up with the pace. But a meeting would, of course, I think, be quite important. North Korea has been asking for many years to have direct contact with the United States. Under the Obama administration, this hasn't really happened. We haven't had those high-profile meetings as we had in the past. It would be important to have a conversation. But oftentimes, when it comes to the United States, meetings have had preconditions. For example, we will be willing to meet if you are doing this first. And this is something that doesn't work very well with the DPRK. They are interested in actually having those direct talks, but without preconditions. So that has to be sorted, obviously, with the US administration.
Now, without preconditions, they would want to sit down. But in terms of what the DPRK would be looking for from the United States and the superpowers, what do you think they'd put on the table?
What could the DPRK put on the table? I mean, the conversation that is happening between the United States, between South Korea, and between the other powers revolve around nuclear energy and the use of nuclear weapons, and they have a different understanding. For a while, we were regulated by the six-party talks, which was about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But parties understood this differently. For the United States, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula meant North Korea stopping its weapons program. For North Korea, the denuclearization of the peninsula meant that they did not want the United States to have nuclear weapons in South Korea. So they have a little bit of a different understanding when it comes to what this means. So I think what's very needed is actually a new type of conversation because the six-party talk has been at a standstill for a good number of years. What seems to be clear to me is that it would be very difficult for the DPRK to say that they would abandon their nuclear weapons program at this point. They would be quite at risk from the international community if they were doing this. There's no real precedent or example that show countries that have decided to abandon their program and that have received much positive insurance from the international community. So I think from the North Korean perspective, it's a no-go. It would weaken very much if they were to abandon those weapons.
Now, does the new missile fundamentally change assessments of the threat from Pyongyang for the superpowers or any other country, even South Korea, which is the closest to North Korea?
Well, I think it does show that the technology is evolving, that they are able, little by little, to have missiles that perform better. There are talks regarding the type of missile that we've seen, that perhaps this is actually a first stage for something that would be an ICBM, a missile that would be able to reach the United States. So, I mean, what it shows is that there's a commitment, that there's also technology and technicians and engineers working on this. For a very long time, I mean, we knew that North Korea was selling a number of weapons to the Middle East, to a number of countries, and that they had replicated technology that was perhaps not that advanced. But what we see here is regardless of sanctions and regardless of a poor economic environment, they are able to mobilize resources to sustain those tests. So the money is coming somehow from somewhere, and they are able to progress little by little.
Now, Dr. Grzelczyk, what's the best way going forward in terms of North Korea and the superpowers, especially the United States? What should happen from here onwards? And, should the superpowers take North Korea more seriously and sort of give in to what they're looking for without the preconditions? Is it likely to happen?
Well, I think what is important is this issue of nuclear safety. We've seen accidents in the past. I think what happens in Japan with the Fukushima reactors, for example, which was accidental, really exposed the danger of nuclear energy. And so when it comes to the DPRK, if they are playing with nuclear technology, we need to make sure that there's a responsible conversation when it comes to that type of energy. So maybe one way forward, which is very contested, which is very difficult politically speaking, would be to accept that the DPRK has nuclear weapons and actually engage into a conversation which is much more about being a responsible stakeholder and a responsible nuclear power. Now, this opens a lot of problems, it opens precedent, and a lot of countries are actually unwilling to accept this. The United States would not be willing to welcome, obviously, the DPRK as a nuclear power. South Korea is not willing to do that as well. There are a lot of reasons as to why this would be very, very problematic. But at the same time, it would remove this underlying reason for the DPRK to develop nuclear weapons. If you tell them, okay, well, fine, we understand, we can talk about this, it delegitimizes the regime a little bit. So perhaps that is a way forward. But I think a new type of dialogue involving the new South Korean president is very much needed at this point. Something has to start changing, and Kim Jong-un hasn't met with foreign leaders yet. And it would be very important, I think, to have some sort of dialogue.
Dr. Grzelczyk, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have to leave it there for now. That was Dr. Virginie Grzelczyk, a lecturer in international relations at Aston University in the United Kingdom, and she joined us from our Pretoria studio.